By November of 1944, the city of Metz had already cost the Third Army casualties approaching 50%, and what happened inside an abandoned brewery on its outskirts would become one of the coldest, most quietly devastating confrontations of the entire war. This is not a dramatization built from guesswork. The exchange you're about to hear was recorded by witnesses present in the room and preserved in the official record of General Patton's wartime papers. It reveals exactly what Patton said when a captured SS general tried to claim he deserved to be treated as a man of honor. What Patton said back didn't just win an argument. It exposed, in a handful of brutal sentences, exactly what kind of war this had been, and exactly what kind of men stood on each side of that table. Before we step into that room, if true stories like this one matter to you, take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and send this video to someone who needs to hear it. Once you've heard what Patton actually said, come back and tell us in the comments which line landed hardest, or what surprised you most. Now, back to Metz. The battle for Metz had been brutal from the start. Unlike most French cities that fell quickly to the advancing Allies, Metz was a fortress, ringed by old forts the Germans had reinforced and were determined to hold at any cost. Third Army troops fought through September, October, and into November, grinding forward field by field, building by building, against an enemy that refused to break. The casualty numbers climbed to levels few units in Europe had absorbed. Commanders on the ground began to wonder if the city would ever fall. Then, on November 19th, after weeks of encirclement, American forces finally closed the ring completely. The systematic work of clearing the city, building by building, cellar by cellar, began the very next day. Nobody knew yet that one of those buildings held a man Patton himself would want to question personally. On the evening of November 20th, a sergeant named Leonard O'Reilly moved through the wreckage of a brewery on the edge of the city. Before the war, O'Reilly had operated elevators in Brooklyn. Now his job was to clear buildings of any German soldiers still hiding inside, room by room, in near total darkness. The brewery had just been abandoned by SS troopers after putting up a hard fight, and there was no guarantee it was empty. O'Reilly moved carefully through the dust and broken machinery, weapon ready, listening for movement in the dark. In a far corner, half hidden in shadow, he saw something that made him stop. A figure was crouched against the wall, perfectly still, watching him. It was a German officer, well-dressed even after days of fighting, clearly someone of rank. When O'Reilly ordered him out, the officer refused to move. He announced, almost indignantly, that his rank was far too high to allow himself to surrender to a mere sergeant. For a moment, in the middle of a collapsing fortress city, an SS officer was arguing about military etiquette with a man holding a gun on him. O'Reilly didn't argue back. He stepped forward, pressed his pistol into the officer's stomach, and pulled back the hammer. Questions of rank and protocol evaporated instantly. The officer rose to his feet without another word and joined the rest of the prisoners being marched out of the brewery. What O'Reilly didn't know yet was exactly who he'd just captured. The man was Major General Anton Dunkern, the SS commander responsible for the entire Metz region. Dunkern had joined the SS back in 1933, in the earliest years of the organization, and had spent more than a decade climbing steadily through its ranks. By 1944, he held real regional power, not a junior officer caught in the wrong place, but a senior commander whose authority touched intelligence, security, and policing across the area. When word reached headquarters about who had been pulled out of that brewery, it became clear this was no ordinary prisoner. This was the kind of capture that could yield real intelligence and real insight into how the enemy thought. That importance is exactly why General Patton decided he wanted to question Dunkern personally rather than leave it to a junior intelligence officer. Patton had interrogated captured Germans before, but rarely one of this rank, and almost never one wearing the insignia of the SS. The two men would sit across from each other in a room arranged for exactly this purpose, witnesses present, an interpreter standing by. What followed wasn't simply an information-gathering session. It became something closer to a verdict being delivered, one man judging another not just as a soldier, but as a representative of everything the SS had built and defended. Before they even spoke, Patton made a decision that revealed exactly how he intended to handle this conversation. Although Patton could speak German fluently, he chose to interrogate Dunkern entirely through an interpreter. He explained his reasoning plainly. He would not give this man the honor of being addressed directly. Every question, every accusation, would pass through a third party, a deliberate, calculated insult before a single real exchange even began. It set the tone instantly. This wasn't going to be two soldiers talking shop. This was going to be a reckoning, conducted at a careful distance, on Patton's terms entirely. And if you've made it this far into the story, this is exactly the moment to pause for a second. Subscribe if you haven't already, tap like, and share this with someone who'd find this exchange as unsettling as you probably do right now. Then leave a comment telling us what you'd have said in Patton's position. Now, the interrogation itself. Patton opened by telling the interpreter to inform Duncan that he had captured a great many German generals before, but never one who had betrayed everything so completely. Duncan, Patton said, had not only served as a Nazi, he had now proven himself untrue even to the Nazis, by choosing to surrender rather than die fighting. If Duncan had anything to say for himself, Patton added, he had better say it convincingly, because the alternative was being handed over to French interrogators, who Patton noted, pointedly, knew how to make prisoners talk. It was an opening line built less to gather facts than to strip away whatever dignity Duncan believed his rank still afforded him. Duncan tried to explain himself anyway. He claimed he had received orders to defend a specific sector around Metz, and that he hadn't died fighting simply because he was physically unable to reach his own weapons before being captured. He insisted there had been no real possibility of continuing the fight once armed Americans had him at gunpoint. As a captured soldier taken by American troops, he argued, he should rightfully be treated as an American prisoner of war, not handed off to anyone else. It was the argument of a man trying desperately to claim the protections of a uniform he'd worn honorably, while standing accused of everything that uniform had come to represent. Patton wasn't interested in the argument. He told Duncan flatly that if he had truly wanted to be a good Nazi, he could have died right there in that brewery, and it would have been a far more pleasant death than what was coming for him now. When Duncan pressed his case again, insisting he deserved treatment as a legitimate prisoner of war, Patton compared dealing with men like him to dealing with vipers, men he felt no obligation to extend any courtesy toward, regardless of the rules of war. Then Patton added one more line, sharper than the rest, that Duncan hadn't simply been a soldier, he'd acted as a policeman, and a low type of policeman at that. That accusation finally provoked something close to real protest from Duncan. He insisted that every day of his life he had acted honestly, rightfully, respectfully, and with humanity toward others, and that no one could ever stand up and accuse him of acting against basic human decency. It was a striking claim coming from the regional SS commander of an occupied territory, and Patton didn't let it pass quietly. He told Duncan, through the interpreter, that no member of the Nazi police apparatus could ever rightfully be described as honorable, no matter how the man himself chose to remember his own conduct. The gap between how Duncan saw himself and what his title actually meant had never been more visible. Patton gave him one last opening anyway. If Duncan truly had nothing to be ashamed of, Patton said, then he should offer something, anything, that might actually change Patton's opinion of him. Duncan's answer was confident and unwavering. No one, he said, would ever be able to prove he had acted against the rules of humanity or against any standard of decent treatment. He admitted he might have made mistakes here and there, as any man does, but insisted he carried no fear of being investigated for anything resembling true inhumanity. He never once, in the entire exchange, conceded the deeper accusation Patton was actually making. Patton ended the interrogation almost as coldly as he'd begun it. He told the guards to take Duncan outside, have his photograph taken, and reminded them, almost as an afterthought, that the bayonets on their rifles happened to be very sharp. No threats were carried out. No further violence followed that we know of. But the message was unmistakable, delivered by a general who had decided this particular prisoner deserved no comfort, no reassurance, and no illusion that rank alone might still protect him. What makes this exchange remarkable isn't just what was said, but what it revealed. A man clinging to the idea of his own honor, confronted by someone who refused to let that illusion stand for even a moment. History, as it often does, added one final twist that neither man could have predicted that night. Anton Duncan was never punished for what investigators later linked to his command. He survived the war, returned to civilian life, and eventually became a practicing lawyer in Munich, living out the rest of his days in relative peace until his death in 1985, at the age of 80. The man Patton called a viper, a low type of policeman, someone untrue even to the cause he'd served, simply went home and built a quiet, ordinary life. That ending sits uneasily next to everything said in that room, and maybe that's exactly the point this story leaves behind. Real history rarely closes as cleanly as we want it to. What Patton understood, sitting across from Duncan in that interrogation room, was something most people only learn the hard way. That titles, ranks, and self-told stories of personal honor mean almost nothing once a man's actual choices are laid out in front of him. Duncan walked into that room believing his record could speak for itself. Patton made sure it couldn't, stripping away every excuse before the conversation even had a chance to begin. That's the kind of moment history rarely preserves this clearly, word for word, witnessed and recorded. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, hit like, and send it to someone who needs a reminder of how thin the line really is between the story a man tells about himself and the truth other people remember instead. And before you go, drop a comment letting us know what you didn't know before today, or which line in that room hit you the hardest.